I want to be precise about this, because I have submitted 3 formal amendments to the Velmarin Surplus Registry, and all 3 have been returned stamped insufficient grounds, and I am tired of being told that the outcome of what happened is somehow my fault. I did not know what I was purchasing. No one did. The lot was listed as non-viable. The listing had been non-viable for 317 years, which means someone had reviewed it at some point and reached a conclusion, and I trusted that conclusion the way any reasonable private acquirer trusts a 3-century-old administrative determination. I trusted it the way you trust the floor of a building you have never personally stress-tested. You assume it has been checked. You assume someone ran the numbers. I am getting ahead of myself. My name is Velketh Orvan. I acquire things. Not professionally. I want to be clear about that before anyone draws an unflattering comparison to any of the ongoing proceedings at the Velmarin Surplus Review Board, whose docket I have no connection to and whose participants I am in no position to comment on. I am an amateur. I acquire objects of historical interest for my personal collection, which occupies the secondary receiving bay of my orbital station in the Velmarin border territories, and which my companion sale says makes the station look like a museum that gave up on itself. She is not wrong. I have 3 decommissioned communications relays from the Kethvoreth administration period, a partial set of navigational plates from a Velsareth survey pinnace, the log core housing of a deep survey vessel, whose registry number I have not been able to match to any accessible administrative record, and the preserved mounting bracket of a weapons array whose provenance I have never been able to confirm to my complete satisfaction. I paid 41 ISC for that bracket. I thought it was significant. It may be. No one has yet agreed with me about that. I also have, in the secondary receiving bay, 17 framed survey charts from the early Veloreth cartographic period, a set of thermal imaging prisms from a decommissioned custom station, 2 navigational chronometers of uncertain manufacture that keep different time at a rate that has not meaningfully changed in 4 years, and a collection of atmospheric sample canisters from 6 different inhabited systems, none of which are labeled in a language I can reliably translate. Sale calls this section the part that makes it look like an archive where the archivist stopped caring. I call it the context section. We have agreed to disagree. The point is, I am not a professional. I am someone who attends surplus auctions when the listings include terms like pre-treaty and original configuration, and unreviewed administrative classification, because those terms sometimes precede objects that are genuinely interesting. And I find genuinely interesting objects to be worth the registration fee and the transit time and the occasional mild disappointment when the object turns out to be exactly what the listing said it was. I attended the Velmarin Surplus Orbital Auction, Cycle 4, 3rd period clearance, because the preliminary listing had described Lot 7 Keth as a registered pre-treaty hull of indeterminate classification, condition non-viable, listed inert per Velmarin Corridor Maintenance Act Review Standard, suitable for material reclamation or display acquisition. 62 characters of administrative language that told me almost nothing. Which is exactly the kind of language that, in my experience, sometimes precedes something extraordinary. The hull was in orbital storage Lot 7 Keth, the outermost berth of the Velmarin secondary surplus yard. It had been there for 317 years. The surplus registry's own records showed no active bids in the preceding 140 years. Before that, there had been 4 registered inquiries, all withdrawn within 72 hours of the inquiring party's inspection request. The registry entry did not explain the withdrawals. I noted them and considered them mildly interesting. I should, in retrospect, have considered them considerably more carefully. 4 separate parties had submitted inspection requests, and 4 separate parties had withdrawn those requests, and not one of them had filed a formal account of what they had found that prompted the withdrawal. The absence of that explanation is, I now understand, itself a piece of information. At the time, I assumed bureaucratic friction. I assumed the inspection process had been too expensive or too inconvenient for organizations primarily interested in material reclamation. I assumed a great many things that turned out to be wrong. The hull was visible from the auction facility's exterior observation level, if you knew which direction to look. I went up there before the proceedings began, which I often do when the lot is an object large enough to see at orbital distance. It was dark. The surplus yard's navigation lighting lit the structural markers of the berth frame, a standard open-lattice parking structure designed for hulls up to 1,200 meters. And somewhere inside that frame, in the dark beyond the navigation markers, the hull was present as an absence. An area where the background field of stars and distant structures was occluded by something large and solid, and entirely without its own illumination. I noted the size. The registry had said 900 meters. Looking at the occluded area, 900 meters seemed approximately correct, though without active lighting it was difficult to be precise about the shape. I noted that the hull was oriented with what appeared to be its bow facing outward from the yard, away from the station hub. I noted that this orientation was consistent with an operational departure posture rather than a storage posture. Storage, for large hulls, typically orients the bow toward the hub for clearance efficiency. And I noted this as interesting. And then the auction began, and I went back inside. The auction itself was attended by 11 registered bidders. I was the only one who had submitted a personal attendance request. The others were bidding remotely, which is standard for material reclamation lots. Those buyers are purchasing mass, not character, and they do not need to see the object to evaluate it. I prefer to attend in person when possible. I like to know what I am acquiring. The auctioneer described the hull in a tone of professional neutrality that I interpreted as suppressed boredom. 900 meters. Pre-treaty classification, specific treaty affiliation not available through standard registry query. Condition, non-viable per most recent review. Last active registration, 317 years prior. No crew manifest on file. No operational history accessible through standard registry query. No active maintenance record in Velmarin administrative custody. The starting bid was 7 ISC, which is the minimum reserve for Velmarin orbital lots, and reflects the assessed value of the scrap alloy alone. The auctioneer noted, in the dry voice of someone reading from a mandatory disclosure checklist, that the hull had been reviewed for treaty encumbrance status, and that no active treaty claims had been returned from the Velmarin Corridor Administration Office against the lot number. He paused briefly after reading this, in a way that suggested he was as uncertain as I was about what that sentence actually meant, and then moved on. The 10 remote bidders passed immediately. I do not think any of them had even opened the visual feed. I bid 9 ISC. The auctioneer confirmed the lot was mine. I want to be clear about why I bid. Not because I had any reason to believe the hull was significant in the way it turned out to be significant. Not because I suspected what it was. Not because of the 4 withdrawn inquiries, or the bow-facing outward orientation, or the treaty encumbrance note that the auctioneer had read in a voice that suggested he did not understand it either. I bid because it was 9 credits for a 900-meter pre-treaty hull that 11 other registered buyers had declined, and in my experience, that specific combination, old, pre-treaty, declined by everyone, listed with an administrative note that the lister appeared uncertain about, occasionally resolves into something worth the fee. I was expecting hull plating with unusual alloy composition. I was expecting navigational components I could not identify. I was expecting something for the secondary receiving bay that Sale would find interesting for approximately 3 days, and then describe as another thing that makes this station look like a storage unit that lost its lease. I was not expecting what the hull was. I want that stated clearly for the record. I dispatched my inspection drone on day 3. I waited that long because the transit paperwork for lot transfer requires 48 hours under Velmarin registry processing standards, and I did not wish to access the lot before the formal ownership transfer was complete. This is standard acquisition practice, and I mention it only because one of the later administrative reviews appeared to suggest that earlier access might have changed the outcome, which I dispute on the grounds that earlier access would only have triggered the same event earlier. The drone was a standard commercial survey unit, Class 7 assessment package, purchased new 4 years prior, certified for interior access on documented hulls up to the 2nd structural tier. I use it for every acquisition. It records atmospheric certification, hull stress indexing, radiation profile, and preliminary internal geometry, and it transmits a continuous visual feed that I watch from the station's primary monitoring bay with a warm drink and a strong preference for nothing unusual happening. I sent the drone in through the primary access port, which was listed as unsealed in the registry documentation. This was accurate. The port was unsealed. The exterior airlock door was in a standby open position that, I noticed when reviewing the drone's visual feed, was not the position of a door that had been forced open or degraded into an open state through material fatigue. It was the position of a door that had been left open intentionally, in the way you leave a door open when you expect someone to come through it at some point. I noted this and categorized it as consistent with pre-treaty construction standards for garrison installations, which I had by this point begun to suspect this hull might be, based on nothing more substantial than the treaty encumbrance note, and the bow orientation, and the general quality of professional unease I had felt looking at the lot from the observation level. But these were impressions, not evidence. I am a collector, not an analyst. The drone entered without incident. I began reviewing the atmospheric readings, all nominal, which was slightly unusual for a hull that old, but not alarming. Pre-treaty construction standards included passive atmospheric maintenance systems, and some of them had been built to last, and I was noting the internal geometry feed, which showed hull corridors of considerably more complexity than I had anticipated for a non-viable classification, when the drone completed its initial survey pulse. This is the part I have been asked to describe in detail for 3 separate administrative reviews, and I will describe it the same way I described it the first time. I did not do anything unusual. The Class 7 inspection drone fires a standard survey pulse as part of its initial geometry mapping protocol. This is what the drone is designed to do. I did not initiate the pulse manually. I did not modify the pulse parameters. The drone executed its standard operating procedure, as documented in the certified operating specification I have submitted as Exhibit 4 to each of the 3 registry amendment requests. The pulse went out, the hull received it. And then something happened that I have spent considerable time since trying to find the right word for, and I have not found it yet, so I will describe what I observed and allow you to supply your own word. The hull received the survey pulse and it categorized it, not reflected it, not absorbed it, not registered it as background noise. It received it and processed it and categorized it, and within 8 seconds of the pulse's transmission, it transmitted a response. I know this because the drone's telemetry feed showed, approximately 8 seconds after the pulse, a response signal on a frequency I did not recognize. Not a reflection of the survey pulse, a response. A structured, patterned response on a carrier frequency that my Class 7 unit flagged as unknown format and logged without interpretation, because it was not in any commercial or administrative frequency dictionary the unit carried. But it was structured. It had internal organization. It was not noise. Something in the hull had received the survey pulse, and something in the hull had decided what it was and what to do about it. And what to do about it was to transmit a response to an address I could not identify. I noted this. I set down my warm drink, I looked at the telemetry log more carefully. The response signal was brief, less than 2 seconds, but in those 2 seconds it had been transmitted outward, not just to my drone, but on a broadcast vector that my station's own passive receivers caught at the edge of their range. The hull had, in response to my drone's standard survey pulse, transmitted something on a frequency I could not interpret, via a broadcast vector that covered an angular range I later calculated at approximately 40 degrees of arc, to an address that did not correspond to any registered receiver in the Velmarin corridor system. I want to be honest, my first thought was that I had triggered a dormant emergency beacon of some kind. Old hulls sometimes have them. They activate on contact and transmit a distress code that no one monitors anymore, because the organization that built them and the organization that maintained them and the organization responsible for receiving their signals have all been decommissioned for longer than I have been alive. I have read about this. It is a minor nuisance and a documentation matter. You file a notification with the Velmarin registry, you log the beacon frequency, and an administrative note is appended to the hull's record. So I was not alarmed. I was mildly interested, the way I am mildly interested by most of the objects in my secondary receiving bay. I was composing, in my mind, the opening lines of the notification I would file with the registry. The next reading came 11 minutes later. My station's passive receivers, not the drones, my stations, recorded a power reading from the hull, not a signal, a power reading, meaning the hull's internal systems had drawn energy from somewhere. My station's receivers are not designed to measure power draws in other structures. They are environmental sensors optimized for background radiation and approach traffic. That they registered a power draw at all suggested the draw was substantial. I am understating this. The draw was large enough that my station's environmental monitoring systems flagged it as a possible local energy event requiring investigation, which is a category normally reserved for things like reactor incidents or large-scale electromagnetic discharges. My station's monitoring system had decided that whatever was drawing power in the orbital lot next door was the kind of thing that warranted attention. I looked at the number, I looked at it again. I checked the receiver calibration log, because I was quite certain the calibration was wrong. The calibration was not wrong. I am not a technical specialist. I have a working familiarity with pre-treaty hull classification standards sufficient to conduct basic acquisitions research, and I have some understanding of power system architectures from the reading I have done in support of my collecting interests. What I knew about that power reading was enough to know it was not consistent with a dormant emergency beacon. A beacon draws milliamperes. What my station's receivers had registered was orders of magnitude beyond that. I called Sale. She was in the habitat section. I said, "The hull is drawing power." She said, "Which hull?" I said, "The new one, the 9-credit lot." She came to the monitoring bay. She looked at the reading. She has a better technical background than I do. She spent 11 years in logistics management for a Veloreth construction consortium before we transferred to the border territories, and she has a practical familiarity with large structure power systems that I have never matched, and she looked at the power reading for a long time without saying anything. Then she said, "That's a reactor sequence." I said, "What kind?" She said, "The kind that starts cold." I did not fully understand what that meant at the time. I understand it now. A cold start reactor sequence is what happens when a hull that has had its reactor in deep maintenance dormancy, not off, not decommissioned, but suspended in a state of minimal activity designed to permit restart, begins the process of bringing that reactor back to operational output. It is not an instantaneous process. It takes time, because the thermal management systems need to cycle in a specific order, and the fuel distribution architecture needs to be pressurized in stages, and the monitoring systems that govern all of this need to come online in a sequence that has been documented and verified for whatever class of reactor is involved. The ICV unasked question had been in deep maintenance dormancy for 317 years. What followed was, in retrospect, the most profoundly strange 41 minutes of my life. Sale and I sat in the monitoring bay of our orbital station in the Velmarin border territories, watching my Class 7 inspection drone's telemetry feed and our own passive receiver readings. And we watched a 900-meter pre-treaty hull that had been classified non-viable and inert for longer than any living person in the Velmarin system, had been alive complete a cold start reactor sequence with methodical, unhurried precision. At minute 6, the primary power conduit network registered at 11% of rated capacity. The telemetry feed showed no visible change in the hull's corridors, but the temperature readings in the drone's environmental sensors had begun to rise, not dramatically, not dangerously, but in the steady, gradual, purposeful way that a large enclosed space warms when something at its center has started generating heat. At minute 9, the drone's orientation sensors registered a vibration in the hull structure. Brief, less than 4 seconds, then silence again, as if something large had shifted in its housing, tested its range of motion, and settled back into position. At minute 14, the hull's internal atmosphere management systems came online. My drone's atmospheric sensors, which had read nominal throughout, now began registering pressure adjustments in compartments the drone had not yet entered. The hull was managing its own air, not maintaining it passively, the way an old hull with dormant support systems might maintain trace atmospheric conditions, managing it actively, adjusting pressure differentials between sections, cycling filters, making changes in real time the way a system makes changes when it has something specific it is preparing the interior for. At minute 19, the external lighting array activated. I was watching the visual feed from my station's approach cameras, because by this point I had activated every sensor my station had that was pointed in the right direction, and I watched the ICV unasked questions hull, which had been dark and still in its orbital berth since before my grandparents were born, begin to show light in its window arrays. Small points of warm orange and cool cyan, spread across the hull's ventral surface in a pattern I later learned was standard for garrison continuance activation sequencing. Section by section, each cluster of windows coming on in a sequence that moved from the engineering section aft to the primary operational sections forward. The way light moves through a building when someone is walking through it room by room, and the person walking through it is very large and very methodical, and has been asleep for a very long time. From the distance of my station, those windows looked like stars coming on, one section at a time, in a darkness that had not had stars in it for 3 centuries. I want to say I was frightened at this point. I was not. I should have been, and I understand now why I should have been, but what I was, with a precision I remember clearly, was entirely without speech. Sale had one hand on the edge of the monitoring console and was not speaking either. We were watching the thing happen and we had no language for it yet. There is a specific quality to watching something that your mind cannot categorize in real time, not fear, not wonder, but a kind of cognitive arrest, a pause in the part of you that normally runs continuously and makes sense of incoming information. That part had stopped. It would catch up later. In the moment, there was only the visual feed, and the power readings, and the window arrays coming on. At minute 23, my drone's telemetry flagged a proximity alert. Something in the hull had moved close to the drone. Not the drone had moved close to something. Something in the hull had moved to the drone's location. The drone's visual feed showed a corridor, unchanged from its prior readings, and then showed a small unit that had entered the corridor from a side passage, stopped at a distance of approximately 4 meters, and was oriented toward the drone with the attentiveness of something that was looking at it. The unit was approximately 60 centimeters in diameter, roughly spherical, with a cluster of sensor housings arranged around its anterior face. It had no visible propulsion system that my drone's cameras could identify, but it was maintaining a stable hover at exactly the drone's altitude. It did not advance. It did not retreat. It simply held its position and regarded my drone with what I can only describe as professional attention. The kind of attention a specialist gives an unfamiliar object when they are deciding what category it belongs to. Not hostile, not welcoming, categorizing. My drone classified it as unidentified internal unit and logged the contact, which I thought at the time was the drone's way of saying it did not know what to make of this, and which I now understand was also an accurate description of my own state. At minute 27, the hull's broadcast systems activated. My station's receivers registered this immediately. 7 frequencies, simultaneous activation, covering what I later learned were the standard garrison continuance notification bands for the Velmarin corridor approach vectors. All 7 of the primary approach headings into the corridor, and 3 secondary bands, and the emergency coordination frequency that had not been actively monitored in the Velmarin system for approximately 200 years. Because the organization responsible for monitoring it had been restructured out of existence in the interval. On all 10 frequencies, at the same moment, the ICV unasked question began to speak. The broadcast content, as I later had it translated with the assistance of a specialist at the Velmarin Historical Documentation Office, who was extremely professional and only visibly shaken for approximately half of our consultation, was a garrison continuance declaration. Standard format, according to the specialist, which meant it was the format that had been standard for this type of declaration at the time the hull was commissioned, which was 3 centuries ago. Hull designation, classification, primary berth coordinates, corridor claim in effect, treaty reference, duration of garrison claim in perpetuity, and a notice to all registered and unregistered vessels approaching the Velmarin corridor that the Iron Covenant garrison installation designated ICV unasked question was active, crewed under continuance protocol, and maintaining its registered claim on all 7 primary approach vectors as of the date and time of the broadcast, which was today. Which was the day my inspection drone had fired its standard commercial survey pulse, which was day 3 of my ownership of Lot 7 Keth. At minute 31, the hull's external weapons array housings opened. I want to be very precise about this, because there has been some confusion in the subsequent administrative documentation about whether the weapons systems were activated. They were not activated in the sense of being aimed, loaded, powered to firing readiness, or directed at any specific target. What happened was that the weapons array housings, the external armored covers that protect the weapons emplacements from the accumulated particulate and radiation exposure of prolonged dormancy, opened. This is a mechanical process, distinct from weapons activation. It is the equivalent of removing a protective cover from equipment before you determine whether or not you are going to use the equipment. The distinction is important, and I want it in the record. My drone's external camera feed showed the hull's profile change as those housings opened. I sat in the monitoring bay of my orbital station and watched ICV unasked question present. For the first time in 317 years, the full silhouette of what it actually was. A 900-meter Iron Covenant garrison dreadnought with its weapons array uncovered, its engine ports lit, its garrison continuance broadcast active across 7 approach frequencies, and a total of 2,314 weapons emplacements now visible to any sensor system that cared to look. Sale looked at the weapons count in the telemetry readout. She said, in a voice that had the quality of someone who has done the arithmetic twice and is not happy with the result either time, "That is a very large number of weapons for a 9-credit lot." I said yes. At minute 41, the cold start sequence completed. The reactor reached operational output. The garrison continuance broadcast intensified, not louder, but denser, the way a signal becomes denser when the transmitter is no longer running on startup power, but on full system output. My station's receivers, which had been registering the broadcast at the edge of their sensitivity range, now registered it clearly enough that I could read the individual data packets in the transmission log without any specialist assistance. Whatever ICV unasked question was saying to the Velmarin corridor, it was now saying it at full volume. I stared at this for a while. Then I went and made another warm drink because I needed something to do with my hands, and then I came back and stared at it some more. Sale said, "You need to call the registry." I said, "I know." I called the registry. The duty administrator who answered was a third-grade compliance officer who had the professional manner of someone who had handled a large number of unremarkable queries and expected this to be another one. I told her I had acquired Lot 7 Keth 3 days prior and was calling to report an anomalous activation event. She asked me to describe the event. I described the event. There was a pause that was long enough that I could hear, in the background of the line, the sound of the administrator consulting with someone off-screen. Then she asked me to hold. I held for 14 minutes, which I now understand was the time required for the duty administrator to escalate my call through 3 levels of supervision and reach someone senior enough to authorize the next step. At the end of the 14 minutes, a different voice came on the line. This voice had the quality of someone who had been told something surprising while eating, and had set their meal aside, and was now engaging with a situation they had not expected to be engaging with today. This voice said, "Can you confirm the hull designation?" I said I could not confirm the designation from the lot documentation, but I could read him the garrison continuance broadcast designation if that was helpful. He said yes. I read him the designation. Another pause, shorter. The sound of rapid input on a console. Then, "Velketh Orvan, I am going to need you to maintain your current position and not approach or contact the hull in any way until the Velmarin Garrison Authority has responded. Can you confirm you understand that instruction?" I confirmed I understood that instruction. He said, "The Garrison Authority has been notified. Expect a response team within 4 hours. Do not approach the hull." He ended the call. I sat in the monitoring bay. My drone was still inside ICV unasked question, still transmitting its telemetry feed, and the small spherical unit was still floating 4 meters away from it with the same composed professional attention it had maintained since minute 23. The hull's garrison continuance broadcast was running steadily on all 10 frequencies. The weapons array housings were open. The engine ports glowed warm orange and cool cyan in the visual feed, exactly the way they had looked when the lighting array first came on at minute 19, except that now the glow was fuller, steadier, powered by a reactor at operational output rather than cold start initiation. I thought about the 9 other lots I had acquired over the years, the communications relays, the navigational plates, the weapons mounting bracket of uncertain provenance. I thought about the 9 ISC I had bid for this hull, and the 10 other registered bidders who had passed at the opening reserve, and the 4 inquiry parties who had submitted inspection requests and withdrawn within 72 hours. And I thought about the 317 years of administrative determination that this hull was inert and non-viable, and whoever had made that determination, and whether they had stood this close to the hull, and whether they had understood what they were looking at, and what had led them to the conclusion they reached. I did not, then, know what the Sethavar Calculation Directorate was. I knew it by name. You cannot operate a collecting enterprise in the Velmarin border territories without some familiarity with the major expansion factions active in the corridor approaches. But I knew it only as an administrative presence, a bureaucratic entity that processed territorial calculations and filed corridor annexation instruments through the Velmarin Outer Reach Coordination Office, the way a dozen other factions processed and filed similar instruments. Methodical, precise, present in the documentation, but not from the perspective of someone acquiring pre-treaty curiosities in orbital lots, particularly relevant. I learned over the next 6 hours how wrong that understanding was. The Garrison Authority response team arrived in a single hull, a Velmarin Transit Authority escort vessel, 40 meters, standard corridor patrol configuration. They parked at a respectful distance from ICV unasked question and transmitted a series of queries on the Garrison continuance frequencies. I watched the exchange on my station's receivers. The queries were administrative in format: hull designation, active crew count, corridor claim parameters, requesting confirmation of garrison status. I watched the hull's broadcast systems transmit responses to each query in turn. The responses confirmed what I had already read in the garrison continuance broadcast. The hull was active under continuance protocol. The corridor claim was in effect in perpetuity per treaty registration, and the garrison installation was prepared to maintain its claim across all 7 primary approach vectors, by whatever means were appropriate to the circumstances. The phrase "whatever means were appropriate to the circumstances" appeared in the treaty standard garrison continuance declaration format, I later learned. It had been in the format for a very long time. It was not a threat. It was a specification. The escort vessel held its position. 40 minutes after its arrival, a second hull appeared, a Garrison Authority Command pinnace, 80 meters, configuration I did not recognize from my collecting research. It parked on the opposite side of ICV unasked question from the escort vessel and began its own series of queries. By this point, 6 hours after my drone had fired its survey pulse, something else was also happening. The Scifi calculation Directorate's annexation formation had been in the Velmarin Outer Corridor approach lane for 11 days. I did not know this at the time. I learned it afterward, from the administrative documentation released as part of the Velmarin Corridor Status Review. The formation comprised 4,412 hulls, ranging from 600-meter calculation vessels to the flagship, which the documentation described as a 1,200-meter directive hull, designated the absolute notation. And it had been proceeding through the outer corridor approach lane on a trajectory that would have brought it to the inner Velmarin corridor boundary in approximately 19 days. At which point it would have filed its corridor annexation instrument, and the annexation process would have proceeded in the way annexation processes in the outer territories had been proceeding for the preceding 400 years. The Scifi calculation Directorate operates on a model they call solved outcome methodology. Every territorial acquisition is modeled as a mathematical problem with a deterministic solution, and the Directorate's institutional function is to identify those solutions and execute them with sufficient precision that the solution is achieved before any opposing variable can meaningfully intervene. They have applied this methodology to 412 separate corridor acquisitions over the preceding 4 centuries. Not one had produced an outcome outside the modeled parameters. Not one. Their formation commanders did not enter corridors they were uncertain about. Their methodology was designed to ensure they were never uncertain, because uncertainty was a function of incomplete data, and the Directorate's data collection systems were the most extensive in the outer territories, and the Directorate's analysts were thorough, and the Directorate's models were run 9 times before any approach was initiated. Their model for the Velmarin corridor had been run 9 separate times over the preceding 11 days. Each run had confirmed the same outcome: 0 significant opposition variables within corridor range, administrative resistance below intervention threshold, annexation timeline, achievable within current formation transit parameters. The corridor was, according to every input their model had received from every sensor platform their formation had deployed over 11 days of approach, completely empty. At hour 2 of ICV unasked questions operational status, the absolute notation sensor arrays registered the garrison continuance broadcast. I was not present for what followed, obviously. I have the documentation. I have the communication transcript released as part of the Velmarin Garrison Authority's post-event analysis, which includes the query traffic between the Directorate's formation command vessel and the hull, and I have read it carefully enough that I could reproduce significant portions from memory. The absolute notation transmitted 4 queries to ICV unasked question over the course of the following 6 hours. The first query was a standard corridor approach notification, requesting confirmation of registered operational status and administrative affiliation. The format was the Directorate's standard first contact protocol, which I gathered from the documentation was normally sufficient to resolve any ambiguity about what a contact was and whether the Directorate's model needed to account for it. ICV, unasked question, did not respond to the first query. The second query, transmitted 47 minutes after the first, requested clarification of the hull's treaty affiliation and current administrative authority. It also requested, per the Directorate's standard second contact protocol, that the installation confirm whether it was operating under active garrison mandate or in a legacy dormancy state that would permit administrative reclassification. ICV, unasked question, did not respond to the second query either. The garrison continuance broadcast continued at steady output on all 10 frequencies. The weapons array housings remained open. The reactor held at operational output. The hull did not alter its broadcast, did not add to it, did not reduce it. It continued saying the same thing it had been saying since minute 27, with the patient repetition of a structure that has been saying the same thing for a long time and does not anticipate needing to say anything else. The third query, transmitted 1 hour and 11 minutes after the second, requested contact with the installation's command authority. It noted that the Directorate had registered the garrison continuance broadcast and was reviewing its approach parameters accordingly, and that it wished to establish direct communication to clarify the current operational status of the installation and the administrative framework governing the corridor claim. ICV, unasked question, did not respond to the third query. The fourth query, transmitted 2 hours and 23 minutes after the third, consisted of a single sentence that the Garrison Authority translator rendered as, "Please confirm this contact is correctly classified under our current operational model." I have read that sentence many times. It does not read like a threat assessment. It does not read like a negotiating position. It reads like an organization that has never had to ask a question of that kind before and has only now discovered that it needs to. The Directorate did not ask what the hull was, or whether it would fire, or whether a negotiated resolution was possible. It asked whether its own model had gotten the classification right. 412 successful acquisitions, and the fifth query it needed to ask was whether its framework had categorized reality correctly. None of these queries received a response from ICV unasked question. The hull's garrison continuance broadcast continued at steady output on all 10 frequencies. The weapons array housings remained open. The reactor held at operational output. I sat in my monitoring bay and read the transcript and thought about the phrase "please confirm." This contact is correctly classified under our current operational model, and I thought I understood what it meant to build an institution whose entire function was the production of certainty, and then to encounter something that did not fit the framework that produced that certainty. Not because the thing was hostile, not because the thing was overwhelming. Because the thing was simply present in a way the framework had determined was impossible, and was not doing anything to confirm or deny the framework's assessment, and was not going to. The hull had been classified non-viable for 317 years. It had not argued with the classification. It had continued its maintenance cycle and waited for the event that would make its response appropriate, and that event had now occurred and the hull had responded, and it had nothing further to add. At hour 9, the Absolute Notation transmitted a formal query to the Velmarin Corridor Administration Office requesting clarification of the ICV unasked questions, current administrative status and treaty registration. The Administration Office transmitted a response citing treaty registration file number, garrison claim establishment date, and continuance protocol activation parameters. The response noted that the garrison claim had been in continuous registration since the hull's original berth placement, that the continuance protocol had been properly triggered, and that the Directorate's formation was operating in a corridor subject to active treaty-registered garrison rights. The Directorate's formation did not respond to this information immediately. Modeling, in the Directorate's framework, means running the scenario through their solution methodology to produce a new deterministic outcome. This takes time. The more variables a scenario contains that fall outside the established parameter set, the more time it takes. ICV unasked question was, apparently, outside the established parameter set in several ways simultaneously. At hour 14, the Directorate's formation resumed advance motion at reduced velocity along the outer corridor approach lane, not withdrawing not yet but not advancing at prior speed. The Garrison Authority's documentation notes this as formation posture, recalculating. At hour 19, ICV unasked questions broadcast systems transmitted a second message on the garrison continuance frequencies. This message was distinct from the standard garrison continuance declaration. It was shorter. The Garrison Authority translator rendered it as follows: corridor claim active, approach is registered, waiting for resolution. 5 words more than the hull had said in response to anything the Directorate had transmitted. 5 words that were not addressed to the Directorate, were not a response to the Directorate's queries, were a statement of operational status transmitted outward on 7 frequencies to the corridor in general, of which the Directorate's formation was simply the current most relevant feature. The hull was not negotiating. It was not threatening. It was noting, for the record, that it had noted the approach and was waiting. The Absolute Notation did not transmit a response to this either. Its formation, however, reduced its advance velocity again. At hour 22, the Directorate transmitted a formal acquisition withdrawal to the Velmarin Corridor Administration Office, not an acknowledgement of the garrison claim, not a concession in treaty terms. A withdrawal of the current annexation instrument on procedural grounds, specifically, that the corridor could not be correctly classified under the Directorate's operational model in the presence of an active garrison variable, and that reacquisition proceedings would be initiated once the variable had been resolved. The Administration Office noted the withdrawal in the formal record. The Directorate's formation of 4,412 hulls completed its velocity reduction over the following 4 hours and began a heading adjustment that took it out of the outer corridor approach lane and onto a transit heading outside Velmarin space entirely. The withdrawal was orderly, methodical, conducted with the precision of an organization that does not retreat but does, under specific circumstances, determine that its models require additional input before an operation can proceed. 4,412 hulls, organized and methodical, changing course. The sensor log records each heading adjustment. The documentation notes the timestamps with the administrative precision that the Directorate would presumably have appreciated. The last entry in the approach lane sensor log records 4,412 hull signatures departing the outer corridor on a heading designated exit transit, Velmarin outer boundary, and then nothing, and then a transit corridor empty of everything, except the garrison continuance broadcast, still running steadily on all 10 frequencies from the ICV unasked question in its orbital berth. The absolute notation transmitted one final query to the Garrison Authority Command pinnace during the withdrawal. Could you advise on the appropriate reclassification category for your installation's historical dormancy period, as this bears on our operational model going forward? The Garrison Authority Command pinnace transmitted a response citing 7 treaty articles and 4 supplemental provisions, and concluding with a paragraph explaining that the ICV unasked questions dormancy period had been an uninterrupted garrison continuance maintenance cycle under Iron Covenant treaty protocols, which did not alter the hull's status, which had been active throughout, which was not a category the Directorate's operational model appeared to contain. The Directorate did not respond to this. Its formation completed its heading adjustment and was gone. ICV, Unasked Questions Broadcast Systems, ran at steady output for another 11 hours. Then, in a sequence that took 3 hours and was the reverse of the cold start activation I had watched in the monitoring bay on day 3, the hull returned its reactor to deep maintenance dormancy. The broadcast systems went quiet frequency by frequency, in the reverse order they had activated. The weapons array housings closed. The engine ports dimmed. The window arrays went dark, section by section, warm orange and cool cyan points extinguishing in the same orderly progression they had appeared in, until the hull was dark again. My drone's telemetry feed showed the small spherical unit hold its position for 37 seconds after the last window array extinguished. Then it withdrew to the side passage it had come from. The corridor was empty again. The following morning, the Velmarin Garrison Authority arrived with 2 officials and a document. The document reclassified Orbital Lot 7 Keth as active garrison installation, restricted military status, Iron Covenant Treaty registration Velmarin 7 Keth primary, access restricted to authorized Garrison Authority personnel, commercial disposition prohibited, public access prohibited, personal access of registered owner prohibited except by written authorization from the Garrison Authority Command. One official handed me the reclassification notice. The other handed me a formal acknowledgement of ownership confirming that I, Velketh Orvan, was the registered private owner of Orbital Lot 7 Keth and all associated hull inventory, and that this ownership conferred on me precisely 0 rights of access, use, inspection, modification, or commercial transaction with respect to the lot's contents, in perpetuity. I own the hull. I am not permitted to go near it. I have submitted 3 formal amendments to the Velmarin Surplus Registry, requesting clarification of the administrative process by which a treaty-registered active garrison installation came to be listed as a non-viable, inert surplus lot. All 3 have been returned stamped insufficient grounds. I accept that this investigation is not going to occur. I accept that the 317 years of error in the administrative record will remain in the administrative record as a resolved matter. What I find I cannot fully resolve even now is not the Directorate's withdrawal or the garrison claim or the reclassification of my lot. I followed the proceedings carefully. I understand what happened. The hull was a garrison installation under treaty. The dormancy listing was an administrative error. The cold start was the correct response to a recognized contact event. The garrison continuance broadcast was treaty compliant. The Directorate's models had no entry for a garrison installation that had been active and registered and present in the corridor for longer than their methodology had existed. And so their models had classified the corridor as empty, and their models had been wrong. I understand all of that. The part I cannot resolve is simpler and harder to locate in administrative language. It is this: the hull had been there the whole time, not dormant in the way that means finished and cold and needing something external to bring it back, dormant in the way that means waiting at minimal output for the event that would make full output appropriate. For 317 years it had maintained its reactor, and its atmosphere, and its broadcast systems in standby, and whatever the small spherical units were had continued their interior work. And the hull had known, in whatever sense a structure knows anything, that its garrison claim was in effect, and that the corridor was its corridor, and that one day something would arrive that merited a response. My inspection drone, with its standard commercial survey pulse, was that something. The Directorate had 412 successful acquisitions behind it, and 4,412 holes in its formation, and 4 centuries of methodology that had never produced an outcome outside its modeled parameters. It had been 11 days in the outer corridor approach lane. It had run its model 9 times. And then my 9-credit lot woke up. I have spent considerable time since trying to understand what I actually purchased. Not legally. What I am trying to understand is the other thing, the thing the 9-credit reserve price did not account for, and the 317 years of non-viable classification did not acknowledge, and the 10 remote bidders who passed at the opening reserve could not have known they were declining. I purchased a thing that had been waiting. A thing built for a specific purpose, by people who understood that the purpose might not be needed for a very long time, and who built the thing anyway with a patience for duration that I cannot fully measure against anything I know. A thing that had outlasted the organization that built it, and the organizations that had come after, and the administrative apparatus that had failed to correctly classify it for 3 centuries, and the 11 bidders who had decided it, was worth at most a material reclamation estimate. A thing that, when the survey pulse came, woke up and did what it was built to do. I own it. I will never stand on its deck. The corridor is empty. The garrison continuance broadcast is in standby, which is different from gone. The hull is there, in its orbital berth in the dark of the storage yard, and when the next contact event arrives, whenever that is, the hull will know what to do. I paid 9 credits for that. I am still not sure what word to use.